The woman's name is Yoon Chai. She was the youngest surgeon in Korea. Her mother was proud of her accomplishments. She often praised her daughter to her neighbors. However, during an operation, the patient died on the spot due to the chief's negligence. The chief was determined to hide the truth. Yoon Chai couldn't stand the thought of her conscience, but she chose to tell the family the truth. This eventually led to her dismissal from the hospital. It all started a few days ago. Yoon Chai received an emergency call from the hospital. The patient was wailing due to severe chest pain. Yoon Chai found out that the patient had undergone a gastric cancer surgery 3 days ago, but it was only a minimally invasive surgery. There wouldn't have been any problems. That's when the patient's heart suddenly stopped. His condition is deteriorating. After Yoon Chai's efforts, the patient's heartbeat was finally restored. Everyone's hearts were hanging in the air. Finally, the CT scan revealed that the patient's heart was perforated due to the chief's surgical error, and then caused mediastinitis. Yoon Chai immediately reported the news to the chief, who was on vacation. She wanted him to come back as soon as possible, but when the chief heard the news, he scolded Yoon Chai for questioning his medical skills. The patient was about to die, but the chief never showed up, just as Yoon Chai was about to operate on the patient. When the chief slowly came to the scene, at this time, the family waiting outside is also anxious. After opening the patient's chest, they realized it was the chief's mistake. Yoon Chai suggested calling a cardio specialist. At that moment, the patient's vital signs dropped again. Yoon Chai rushed forward to do cardiac compressions, but before the vital signs disappeared, the chief announced the patient's death. He turned around and left the operating room. Yoon Chai couldn't believe that the chief of the department would do such a ridiculous thing. After coming out, the chief lied to the family's questions. He even lied that the patient died of exhaustion. The family couldn't understand. Didn't they say it was just a minor surgery? Didn't they say she'd be discharged tomorrow? Now their daughter is gone. How can they live with a granddaughter who's seriously ill? He was looking at the chief of the department. Yoon Chai tried to persuade him to apologize and compensate the family, but the chief was worried about his reputation. He refused to admit his mistake. He also told Yoon Chai not to ask about it. This created a rift between the two men. On this day, Yoon Chai had just finished her morning run. She was stunned by a sudden car accident. Out of her instincts as a doctor, she rushed the patient to the hospital. On the way to the operating room, the patient's heart was about to stop. The assistant doctor is hesitant to inject the patient with epinephrine. Yoon Chai quickly takes the needle and sticks it into the patient's heart. This is a very clear-cut scene. The male colleague froze in his tracks. Due to the severity of the injury, the patient's spleen had to be removed. But when the operation came to a critical moment, the patient's vital signs suddenly dropped rapidly. The assistant surgeon was overwhelmed by fear. Yoon Chai gave a firm look to his colleague. Then he reassured him to adjust his mind. Otherwise, the patient's death may not be caused by a car accident, but by medical malpractice. Then he calmly removed the spleen and skillfully sewed up the wound. At the same time, another doctor quickly ran to the chief's office. He told the chief that the patient was the heir to the Zaibatsu group. He immediately went to the operating room. After learning about the patient's injuries and the entire procedure from Yoon Chai, he appeared in front of the media. He took all the credit for it. Yoon Chai was used to this. Then he turned around and left the scene. Yoon Chai remembered that the chief had misdiagnosed the patient and caused his death. Out of professional ethics as a doctor, she thought twice and decided to tell the family the truth. The chief of the department was furious. He slapped Yoon Chai in the face. He told her to pack her things and leave the hospital immediately. But the next day, her mother was diagnosed with a heart condition. The doctor told her to go to a bigger hospital for further tests. But the mother didn't want to cause any more trouble for her daughter. Finally, at the persuasion of her sister, and because she missed her daughter, so she brought her daughter's favorite food to the hospital. The mother didn't know that her daughter had been expelled. Yoon Chai didn't want to worry her mother, so he hung up the phone in a hurry. But the next day, Yoon Chai received a call from her neighbor. Her mother had suffered a heart attack and was in a coma. Yoon Chai immediately borrowed a helicopter from the young tycoon he saved. She went to her mother's island with a sense of anxiety. When she arrived, her mother had already lost her vitals. She rushes forward and tries desperately to revive her mother. The doctor tells her the patient is dead, but Yoon Chai is not ready to accept this. But no matter how hard she tried, she lost her mother. Thinking back to her mother's last call, it turns out that her mother didn't bring her here to see a doctor. She wanted to treat herself. If I had been more concerned about my mother, if I had listened patiently to her explanations, I wouldn't have been unable to see my mother for the last time. As a doctor myself, I didn't realize that the last thing I could do for my mother was to announce her death. This made Yoon Chai regretful. After leaving the hospital, Yoon Chai had no choice but to work on a medical ship with poor medical conditions. On this day, an old man from the island came to the medical ship with his unconscious grandson. The doctors found out that it was acute appendicitis. He needs to be operated on immediately, but the wind is too strong on the island. The helicopter can't get to the ship. and the ship's medical equipment is too poor. They can't operate on him. The grandfather broke down and begged them to save the child, but the doctors on board were unable to do anything. Just when everyone was in despair, a familiar voice came out. Yunchai told them that the surgery could be done. Just as she stepped forward to diagnose the boy, she was stopped by a doctor who asked for his identity. After learning that Yunchai was a new surgeon, the captain immediately took her to the operating room. But there's nothing but dust in here. The operating lights are broken. There's no anesthetic for the surgery. At least there must be a place to sterilize it. When we found out that the dental room was available, Yunchai immediately grabbed the boy. He took him to the dental office. Then he instructed the nurse to prepare for the surgery. The male doctor thinks it's ridiculous to use dental tools for open heart surgery, so he pulled Yunchai outside and told her to wait for the helicopter. But if we don't operate now, the helicopter will take 3 hours to get there and back. If the kid gets worse in the middle of the trip, his life may not be saved. While the two were at a standstill, the nurse came to tell them that the boy's blood pressure and pulse suddenly dropped. The grandfather was paralyzed with fear. The current situation requires immediate surgery. In the midst of the panic, the nurse accidentally broke the only bottle of anesthetic. It was hard to find another bottle, but it was only 5 milliliters. It can only last half an hour at most. Yunchai, with her excellent medical skills, the surgery began. As time passes by, everyone is anxiously waiting for the result of the surgery. This is the first surgery on a medical ship. With the appendix out, the boy is finally out of danger. The operation was a success. Everyone here is excited. The captain is also happy to have Yunchai on board. But by the end of the night, Yunchai asked the captain to leave. The captain didn't understand why she was leaving so suddenly. Yunchai said the medical conditions on the ship were too poor, and that staying would only prevent her from saving lives. For a talent like Yunchai, how could the captain not cherish such a talented person like Yunchai? If we don't have the conditions, we'll create them. An appendicitis operation like today's is only a minor operation in a big hospital, but on a ship, it can kill many people. Compared to the big hospitals, it's more important to have you here. The captain's words struck the most vulnerable spot in her heart. If her mother had been treated properly, she wouldn't have been unable to see her last, so she decided to stay. The next day, they were about to go on a medical tour of the island, but the village chief fell down with a sudden illness. Yunchai immediately intubated him, but the doctor noticed that the village chief's stomach was bulging. It's a clear sign of a large aneurysm. After another examination, he found that his blood pressure was dropping. That means the aneurysm has ruptured. We need to stop the bleeding immediately. After a simple sterilization, Yunchai operated on the patient. As soon as the abdominal cavity was opened, the scene was so gruesome that everyone dared not look at it. Yunchai immediately used his hand to block the bleeding port. Luckily, the rescue plane arrived in time, but the patient had to be operated within 15 minutes. After contacting the nearest hospital, there is no surgeon who can operate. It would take at least 40 minutes to get to another hospital, so he had no choice. Yunchai landed the plane at the nearest hospital. As soon as the plane landed, the doctor who met the plane gave Yunchai a hard time. Didn't he say there was no surgeon who could operate? Upon hearing this, Yunchai volunteered to take over the surgery. When questioned about the safety of the patients, Yunchai didn't give a clear answer. All she knew was that the longer the patient was delayed, the lower the chance of success. The patient was then admitted to the hospital, and the surgery was performed. The president was furious when he learned of this. He blamed his subordinates for the hospital's reputation if the operation failed. But when he came to the operating room, he saw Yunchai's skillful surgery. He was in disbelief. After witnessing everything, the director found Yunchai coming out of the operating room. He wanted to hire her to work at the hospital. Yunchai didn't want to give up her job on the medical ship, but she could use her free time to take care of the hospital's emergency surgeries. That's how they came to an agreement. Right after that, the chief received a call from the director. When he found out that Yunchai was going to the emergency department, he blamed Yunchai for his own mistake. The next day, Yunchai was called to the hospital by the director. He cancelled the agreement on the pretext that the emergency room was full. Although Yunchai was fine with it, Yunchai is fine with it, but there's no way the emergency room is suddenly full. She wanted to know the real reason. Then the director told her about the previous medical incident. Yunchai didn't defend herself. She took it all in stride. Then, the story of Yunchai's accident became widely known on the ship. Her co-workers avoided her appearance. The captain of the ship was furious and found her. He asked her to leave as soon as the ship docks. Yunchai was speechless, but she didn't give any explanation. But at night, the medical ship suddenly hit a wave. The man was trying to save the medical supplies, and his arm was crushed by the hatch cover. The crew who witnessed this rushed to find Yunchai. When Yunchai arrived, he found that the man had no pulse in his injured arm. The crew pleaded with Yunchai to save the man's arm, no matter what. Yunchai, without saying a word, poured a bottle of disinfectant on the man's hand. Then he sterilized the axe on his hand. Before anyone could react, she pressed down on the man's hand. She swung the axe and chopped down, with the man wailing in pain. The crowd was stunned by the scene. When the crew members nearby saw this, grabbed Yun Chai by the collar and scolded her for her madness. They were about to attack Yun Chai. Luckily, a doctor came and stopped her. It turns out that the purpose of the amputation is to save the man's hand. If the wrist is not amputated, the arm would have rotted and died. Luckily, the amputation surface is relatively flat. As long as it's attached within 6 hours, he won't be disabled. But the helicopter we managed to contact was unable to land on the ship due to the wind and waves. In these extreme conditions, it's difficult for the medical ship to move. So the chairman of the board found Yun Chai and asked her to operate on the man. But this kind of surgery is out of her range, and hand-on osteomosis surgery is much more difficult. Even in plastic surgery, only experienced doctors can do it. There is one person who can help, the director of the hospital. But because of a medical incident, Yun Chai had a bad relationship with the director. She is so cold and arrogant that she won't let go of her face and ask the director for help. This is incomprehensible to the director. For the sake of his petty pride, a doctor puts his patients in danger. After the chairman's mockery, Yun Chai thought twice. She finally dialed the president's number, despite previous conflicts. But the director agreed to help Yun Chai fully. Because of the special nature of the surgery, he needed the help of a camera crew. The team went into action immediately. Under the director's remote guidance, the unprecedented live webcast of the surgery began. The whole operation attracted the attention of millions of netizens. At this time, the chief was also silently watching the whole thing. He thinks that Yun's multidisciplinary and difficult surgery is just for hype. There's no way it will succeed. While everyone on board is waiting for the result of the surgery, an accident has occurred. The patient's vein was too short and couldn't be connected. The director of the hospital reminded us that we could use a vein from the other side. With the director's guidance, Yun's excellent medical skills, the man finally regained feeling in his fingers. Everyone in the audience was excited about the success of the surgery. The dean was also impressed by Yun's excellent medical skills. Even the captain, who wanted to fire her, shouted for her. Then the man was taken to the hospital. After a thorough examination by the director, the surgery was a success. After the cooperation between the two of them, the director has a new understanding of Yun's character. No matter what kind of trouble she caused before, he invited her to work at the hospital. The media is waiting at the entrance of the hospital to interview this amazing woman. Only the chief was worried that Yun Chai would not reveal her secret to the public. As Yun's reputation grows, many people are lining up to see her. At the same time, the medical ship had a special patient. Everyone shunned her. She's the famous goddess of the neighborhood. After meeting Yun Chai, she neither consulted nor hospitalized. She just smiled and asked Yun Chai to get some good medicine. She told her to fill up her parcel and leave. In return, she could read Yun's fortune. Yun Chai told her that instead of worrying about other people's business, she should worry about her own. Then he asked the nurse to take the goddess for a blood test, but she refused to go. She said it would offend the gods. Yun Chai told her that if she didn't get treatment in time, she would die soon. When she heard that, she was not happy. She came forward and pulled Yun's hair. She didn't let go. The nurses rushed forward to stop the fight. There are more and more people watching, but she wouldn't let go, until the doctor whispered to her. Then she let go. A colleague wondered how he did it. After learning that he only promised to double the fortune-telling money for the woman, the crowd was amazed. It was hard to calm the woman down for a checkup, but when the doctor told her she had to go to a big hospital for treatment, the woman immediately lost her composure. She wanted to leave. She got up and spat blood on the doctor. The nurse was so scared that she found Yun Chai. She took her to the hospital. After examination, it was found that she had advanced cirrhosis of the liver. She needs to be hospitalized. After her health stabilizes, she'll need a liver transplant. That's a lot of money. Despite Yun's persuasion, Granny still wants to leave the hospital immediately. Yun Chai was helpless. Yun Chai couldn't help but agree to her request. Yun Chai followed her out and saw the old woman's lonely back. He felt bad about it. The old woman didn't go home after she left. She went to her daughter's food stand. Her mother hadn't seen her for a long time. Her daughter didn't look happy either. They hadn't seen each other for 10 years. But the first thing her daughter asked her was why she was there. She blamed her mother for embarrassing her. Her mother tried to care for her, but she asked her if she wanted everyone to know she was the daughter of a godmother. But she didn't realize that her mother wanted to see her one last time in her lifetime. In spite of her daughter's harsh words, she didn't say a word about her illness. She handed over her savings to her daughter. She left with her illness. Instead of seeing a doctor, her daughter's marriage was more important. The next day, Granny called the ship's traditional Chinese medicine, TCM, doctor. She hoped to live for another month through Chinese medicine, to see her daughter get married. But she was stopped by Yun Chai, who came running. She believed that acupuncture would put the patient at risk of bleeding and infection. The two of them then argued about Chinese and Western treatments. The godmother was fed up with it, so they were kicked out. On their way home, Yoon Chai learned from her colleagues. Yoon Chai learned from her co-workers that the granny didn't do the surgery because she wanted to save more money for her daughter. This reminds her of her own mother. She couldn't bear to see such a tragedy happen again, so she went back to the woman's house to persuade her to have the operation. More than material gifts, spiritual gifts are even more precious. Why did she let herself go with regrets? Why not take more time to gain her daughter's understanding? Why let her daughter live in regret? In the face of the godmother's stubbornness, Yoon Chai was both angry and helpless. So, Yoon Chai had to find the godmother's daughter. He told her the news that she was critically ill, but to her surprise, she was already spitting blood and collapsed. Then she was rushed to the hospital. The situation was critical. The daughter agreed to do a liver transplant for her mother. The operation began. With Yoon Chai's help, mother and daughter finally saw each other again. The daughter feels remorseful for not understanding her mother. Afterwards, mother and daughter hugged and cried. Yoon Chai looks at her mother's legacy. The first pair of shoes she wore, the first set of clothes she wore, and the lessons her mother taught her before she died. Yoon Chai burst into tears. The truth is always unpredictable, and the days are numbered. The regrets and remorse of the past. Do we still have a chance to make amends? On this day, the hospital received an emergency patient. The man was rushed to the hospital because he had trouble breathing. After testing, he was found to have advanced rectal cancer. The patient is now in a critical condition. Yoon Chai said he could do an in situ liver transplant. The doctors and the director of the hospital have never heard of this before. When colleagues asked about the success rate and success stories, Yoon Chai said that it's still in the process of validation. No one in China has ever done such a surgery. Colleagues think it's too risky, but it's the only treatment available. If the patient is not operated immediately, he has at most 6 months to live. Then she found cases on the internet that matched her thesis, and asked her former colleague to help her organize the information. However, their conversation was overheard by a close associate of the chief, and reported all of Yoon Chai's plans to the chief. When Yoon Chai wanted to tell the patient the good news, but he saw the chief in the patient's room. When asked about the purpose of his visit, the chief said he was just visiting the patient. Then he called Yoon Chai outside the ward. He was scolding Yoon Chai in a mock manner, that she's not qualified to be a doctor, and that she's jeopardizing her patient's lives for the sake of publishing her thesis. Yoon Chai didn't think she did anything wrong. Their conversation was overheard by a passing colleague. The co-worker agreed that Yoon Chai shouldn't have used the patient as a test subject. In order to prove himself, Yoon Chai went to the director's office. He hoped that the dean would give him a chance. While facing the dean's doubts, Yoon Chai suggested that he could prove himself by simulating a surgery first. If he can't finish the surgery within 10 hours, he would give up completely. After obtaining the director's approval, she requested a body from the hospital. She started the simulated surgery. With her theoretical knowledge and medical skills, Yoon Chai succeeded in the operation within 6 hours. By the evening, Yoon Chai told the patient to get ready for surgery, but the patient refused. The next day, Yoon Chai was approached again by the chief of the department. He said that the patient didn't trust the local hospital. He agreed to operate on the patient himself. Yoon Chai didn't want to listen to his nonsense and turned around to leave. At this point, the chief showed his ugly face. He asked Yoon Chai to come to their hospital to operate on the patient. All the medical staff and supplies are at Yoon Chai's disposal, but the paper had to be published under his name, although Yoon Chai was reluctant to do so. But considering the lives of the patients, Yoon Chai agreed to the chief's request. Finally, under Yoon Chai's full attention, after a few months, the patient finally got a new life. On this day, everyone on the medical ship was taken hostage by a group of gangsters. Their target was clear. It's the ship's miracle doctor, Yoon Chai. They want Yoon Chai to operate on their boss. They're about to take her away. My colleague Hyunwoo tried to stop them, but he shot him in the face. At the same time, the sound of the gunshot attracted the attention of the coast guards. Luckily, the bullet hit the wall. Hyunwoo, who had come to his senses, it's impossible to do even a simple operation alone, so he volunteered to go with him. Then the two of them started to prepare the first aid kit. Yoon Chai complains that he's not doing it right. Unbeknownst to her, Hyunwoo had already fallen in love with her. When they're forced to go to the gang's base, Yoon Chai is stunned. The ground is littered with corpses. While she was being escorted to the building, a man on the ground suddenly grabbed Yoon Chai's leg. Yoon Chai tried to go forward to check the situation. The assailant drew his pistol. He shot the man on the ground and killed him. Yoon Chai was so scared that she sat on the ground. Hyunwoo tried to comfort him, but the assailant pushed him into a corner. He pointed the gun at Hyunwoo and warned Yoon Chai, if he keeps meddling in his own business, he'll be the next one to die. After they were brought inside, the boss was dying of a gunshot wound in the abdomen. They immediately examined the patient. They found that the right kidney of the boss may have been injured by the bullet. His blood pressure dropped below 70. Yoon Chai wanted to transfer Boss Black to the medical ship, but he was opposed by his fighters. But there's no way to operate in such a filthy environment. The thugs don't care about that. They threatened to operate immediately. Yoon Chai said she didn't want to turn her scalpel into a killing tool. This statement also enraged the assailant. Hyunwoo tried to explain, but the assailant pointed a gun at him and asked, "Are you trying to lure them to the medical ship and kill them all?" While they were arguing, Boss Black's condition suddenly deteriorated. The two of them quickly organized intubation to ease his condition. Hyunwoo asked again to transfer Boss Black to the medical ship. The assailant agreed, but on one condition: if the operation can't be completed within 3 hours, they will kill everyone on board. At the same time, the Marine Police couldn't find any trace of the medical ship on the GPS. Their intuition tells them that there must be something wrong. The operation on the medical ship has already begun. With the successful removal of the first bullet, the operation has been a success. The next step is to remove the damaged organs. The fighter is also very satisfied. He thinks Yoon Chai is really something. At the same time, a doctor in the cabin was secretly calling for help, but he was discovered by the gangsters. Then they beat him up. Hearing screams from the cabin, Yoon Chai asks why they went back on their word. Wasn't it before the appointed time? The gangster learns that someone is trying to call the police, but since the operation was not yet completed, the fighter didn't give them a hard time. He just asked them to finish the surgery as soon as possible. At that moment, Yoon Chai was trembling with fear. Under the comfort of Hyunwoo, Yoon Chai was able to finish the surgery with his mental strength. The doctors in the operating room were pressed into the cabin, just when Hyunwoo and Yoon Chai thought they could breathe a sigh of relief. But the assailants pulled Yoon Chai over to them. They demanded Yoon Chai to be their hostage. Hyunwoo offered to take Yoon Chai as a hostage, but he was kicked away. The situation was critical. Yoon Chai had no choice but to agree to their demands. At that moment, the assailant received the news that the medical ship was surrounded by the Marine Police. In a panic, he rushed to check the situation, but Hyunwoo pushed him out of the operating room. He immediately closed the door, but this also completely enraged the other side. The assailant raised his gun and shot at them. When they escaped, the assailants rushed into the operating room again. Luckily, Hyunwoo got a fire extinguisher in time and sprayed on the assailant. Then he grabbed Yoon Chai and ran out of the operating room. Enraged, the assailant immediately got up. He raised the gun in his hand. Seeing that the woman he loved was in danger, Hyunwoo pulled her behind him, but he was shot himself. Luckily, the Marine Police arrived in time to subdue the assailant. Hyunwoo slowly fell into Yoon Chai's arms. Everyone on the medical ship was finally rescued. Hyunwoo was rushed to the hospital. The right side of his abdomen was pierced by a bullet. He had to be operated on immediately. But it's a weekend. There's no surgeon at the hospital who can operate. Yoon Chai looked at the dying Hyunwoo on the hospital bed. She had no choice but to operate herself. When she came to the operating room, Yoon Chai looked down at Hyunwoo, thinking about how he risked his life to save himself. She couldn't help but be moved to tears. As the surgery began, colleagues outside the operating room were also impressed by Yoon Chai's calmness. Because he had been through a sleepless surgery before, Yoon Chai was already physically exhausted, but she managed to complete the surgery for Hyunwoo with great perseverance. Soon after, Hyunwoo finally woke up, but when she saw Yoon Chai, the first thing she said was that she cared if she was hurt. Yoon Chai was moved to tears again. Hyunwoo wiped away Yoon Chai's tears, although there were no sweet words. But after this, they both fell in love with each other. A few months later, Hyunwoo was discharged from the hospital. His co-workers prepared a warm welcome ceremony for him, but unfortunately, they didn't see Yoon Chai, so he drove to the medical ship alone. Yoon Chai was helping Hyunwoo on the ship. While she was complaining about Hyunwoo, she turned around and saw Hyunwoo standing in the doorway with a bad smile on his face. He asked her what she was doing in someone else's clinic. Yoon Chai first congratulated Hyunwoo on his recovery. Then she opened the drawer and took out a gift for him. Hyunwoo happily opened it. It's a high-grade stethoscope. Yoon Chai said that as an internist, you can't make do with a stethoscope. After saying that, he tried to run away from the scene, but Hyunwoo grabbed him. Yoon Chai was nervous and shy. Then Hyunwoo confessed his love for Yoon Chai, and so began their sweet relationship. The next day, Yoon Chai went to the hospital as usual, but she saw her father, who had been missing for years. She found out from the doctor that her father has bile duct cancer. Her brother asked Yoon Chai what to do, but Yoon Chai turned around and left without saying a word, and locked herself in her room. She couldn't forgive her father for abandoning her family. Before Yoon Chai could recover from her grief, her father suddenly went into cardiac arrest. Doctors rushed to take emergency measures, but her father's heartbeat didn't return. When the doctors couldn't do anything, Yoon Chai rushed to the hospital bed. He asked the doctor to prepare for a bile duct drainage surgery. In the operating room, they found that the tumor was blocking the bile duct and causing inflammation. The bile had to be removed from the patient's body, but because Yoon Chai is the patient's family member, the doctor suggested that she should arrange for someone else to do the surgery for her, but Yoon Chai insisted that the surgery should continue. With the elimination of bile, father is out of danger for the time being, but when he woke up, the first person he saw was Hyunwoo, because he owed a lot of loan sharks. I bought a cancer insurance a month ago. As long as the diagnosis is not made for 90 days, he'll get a large amount of compensation. He wants to pay off all his debts before he dies, and compensate Yoon Chai. He asked Hyunwoo to hide Yoon Chai from him, to erase the fact that he was checked for cancer at the hospital. Their conversation was overheard by Yoon Chai outside the hospital room, thinking that his father, whom he hadn't seen for many years, was about to leave him forever. Yoon Chai couldn't hold back her tears anymore, so she went to the dean's office. She told him that she was ready to operate on her father, but considering that bile duct cancer surgery is difficult, Yoon Chai is a family member of the patient. In order to avoid suspicion, the dean told Yoon Chai to find another doctor to perform the surgery, but the surgery was very difficult. The patient's condition is very serious. The only person who can perform this kind of difficult surgery is the chief who fired him. The director advised her to put aside her grudge and ask the chief for help. Leave the dean's office. Considering their previous grudges, Yoon Chai couldn't find the courage to call the chief. Then Yoon Chai went to her father's hospital room. Yoon Chai saw his father packing his bags and getting ready to leave. Yoon Chai told her father to change into a hospital gown and lie down on the bed. His father knew he wouldn't live long. He didn't want to cause Yoon Chai any trouble. Yoon Chai told his father not to run away. He would find a way to cure him no matter what. The next day, Yoon Chai went to Seoul Hospital to find his former nausea chief. Knowing Yoon Chi's intention, he agreed to Yoon Chi's request under false pretenses. As soon as Yoon Chai thanked him, he rejected Yoon Chi's request on the grounds that he had a full schedule of surgeries. Then he just got up and left. Despite Yoon Chi's repeated pleas, he didn't show any respect for him. Seeing the chief's firmness, Yoon Chai threw away all his dignity, turned around and kneeled on the ground, hoping that the chief would agree to help save his father. But the chief was not moved. Instead, he accused Yoon Chai of moral abduction. The chief just walked out of his office. Yoon Chi's former student overheard the conversation and defended Yoon Chai. He accuses the chief of hypocrisy. Yoon Chai never failed him, and he's just trying to save him from death. Yoon Chai, who heard the argument, rushed out. He told the student that he shouldn't talk to the chief in such a manner. Then he apologized for the chief on behalf of his student. After hearing this, the chief left with a sulky look on his face. At the hospital, his father's condition deteriorated again. He was diagnosed with a bile duct hemorrhage. We need to operate before the patient goes into hemorrhagic shock. When the director asked if the chief had been invited, Yoon Chai is always trying to protect the chief's image. The answer he gave was that he was too busy to do so. Before the surgery, the director rushed to Seoul Hospital and found the chief. He told him that Yoon Chai was going to operate on his father. The chief was surprised. The director wanted him to help Yoon Chai. As a doctor, he can't just let him die. The chief was silent. After the director left the hospital, the chief's student asked him why he didn't operate on Yoon Chi's father. The chief said that the presidential election was coming up. He said he couldn't afford to make any mistakes at this time. Plus the success rate of Yoon Chi's father's surgery was too low. He didn't want to take the risk. Yoon Chai finally took it all. Before approaching the operating room, his father grabbed Yoon Chi's hand. He told Yoon Chai not to blame himself if anything happened. After hearing his father's words, Yoon Chai stood there sadly. He couldn't save his mother in time. She can't afford to lose her father this time. But she just walked into the operating room. She realized that the chief was here. Yoon Chai looked at the chief who was preparing for surgery. Tears welled up in her eyes. She bowed deeply to the chief to thank him, and left the operating room. Then the surgery started. Everyone is doing their best to save the patient's life. As time passes, the operation was about to be a success, but an accident happened at the critical moment. The patient was bleeding heavily, but we couldn't find the bleeding port. His blood pressure is dropping. Unaware of the situation, Yoon Chai waited anxiously outside the operating room. Finally, the door to the operating room opens. Yoon Chai rushed forward to ask what the result was. Luckily, the result was good. Yoon Chi's heart was hanging in the air. After the surgery, the chief stayed alone in the operating room for a long time. Yoon Chai brought him coffee with sugar as he used to do. The two of them were chatting in the operating room. Yoon Chai expressed his gratitude to the chief again. The chief also apologized for the mistakes he made in the past. The two of them reconciled their differences and opened their hearts to each other. Before leaving, the chief asked Yoon Chai to return to Seoul Hospital. He wants to promote her to associate professor, but Yoon Chai told him that she can't leave the medical ship anymore. She refused the chief's offer. That day, the medical ship received a distress call. A traveler has fallen from a mountain. He is now unconscious. The medics immediately went to check on him, but when Yoon Chai jumped out of the car, suddenly felt a stabbing pain in his leg. Facing the concern of her colleagues, she didn't take her injury seriously, because she didn't want to delay the rescue of the patient. After examination, the patient in the process of rolling down the leg suffered a serious impact, resulting in bruises in the muscles. She had to go to the medical ship immediately for surgery. After operating on the patient, Yoon Chai still felt discomfort in her leg. When Hyunwoo saw it, she asked about Yoon Chi's condition, but she told Hyunwoo that she just twisted it when she got off the car. Finally, at Hyunwoo's request, Yoon Chai went to the chairman of the board of directors for a CT scan. but when the results came back, the chairman of the board looked at the CT picture on the computer. He thought there was something dirty on the computer screen, so he wiped it with his hand, but he couldn't get it off. At that moment, Yun Chai opened the door and asked the chairman about the CT results. When she found out that she had bone marrow cancer, Yun Chai couldn't believe it herself. The chairman of the board advised her to go to the hospital for a thorough checkup. Yun Chai didn't want to worry the people around her, so she asked the chairman to keep her illness a secret. Then she went to the hospital where she worked part-time. She used a scalpel to cut the skin of her leg. Then she picked up a needle. He took a deep breath and pushed the needle into the leg bone. Even though she was sweating profusely, she gritted her teeth and endured the physical and internal pain to extract a sample of bone marrow from her leg. Then she found a colleague at the hospital. She asked them to analyze the sample for her, anonymously. But things don't always work out the way they're supposed to. Diagnosed with bone marrow cancer, Yun Chai could only hide in a corner by herself. When she saw the call from Hyunwoo, she didn't know what to do. After a night of deliberation, she decided to face the future alone, so she left a letter to her boyfriend. Under the pretext of going abroad for further study, she left without saying goodbye. One day a month later, Hyunwoo came to the chairman's office to help someone find a CT, but she found Yoonji's case by accident. At that moment, the chairman of the board of directors came in. Under Hyunwoo's pressure, the chairman admitted that Yun Chai was sick, so Hyunwoo drove all night to the hospital where Yun Chai was staying. But the moment he pushed open the door of the hospital room, he saw Yun Chai lying thin and emaciated on the hospital bed. Hyunwoo couldn't hide his sadness. He quietly stood in front of Yun Chai's bed. When Yun Chai was woken up, she immediately sat up after seeing Hyunwoo. She didn't pay any attention to her boyfriend's concern. When Hyunwoo asked about her condition, Yun Chai shouted at him to leave. In the end, Yun Chai was too emotional and had a severe reaction to the chemotherapy. Then she went into the bathroom and locked the door. Hyunwoo kept calling out to her. Yun Chai didn't pay any attention. She didn't want her boyfriend to see her now. Finally, after Hyunwoo's patient persuasion, Yun Chai went out of the bathroom, but when she lay back on the hospital bed, she still ignored Hyunwoo. Seeing that the persuasion was futile, Hyunwoo had to take out the notebook he had with him. In it, there was a godmother. There were also children from the neighborhood. Watching the video of the patients he had helped, Yun Chai was touched. Looking at the sad Yun Chai, Hyunwoo turned her towards him. He then told her that he couldn't leave Yun Chai in his world. Under Hyunwoo's persuasion, Yun Chai couldn't hold back her tears any longer, so she hugged Hyunwoo and cried bitterly. In the end, with Hyunwoo by her side, Yun Chai went to the operating room. The one who operated on her was the director, who had always cared for her. Before the surgery, he promised to give her a leg that could stand for 100 years. 1 year later, a grandfather rushed to the medical ship with his grandson in his arms. He was examined and found to have acute appendicitis. The marine police can't come. The helicopter couldn't fly either. When everyone was at a loss, that familiar voice rang out again. Well, the drama ends here. If you're interested in the channel, please like and follow us. See you next time.